All right, so last week we sort of remember we were going to break up the history, like our own history, into sort of the bad news and the good news, right? So last week we were kind of focused on the bad news about the fall, and how it left us kind of in this constant like interior tug of war, where sort of our higher nature and our lower nature, and especially our capacity in our lower nature to rationalize, to embrace our brokenness, and it's always lurking kind of and pulling us down, right? And remember John Paul II, quoting the words of Christ, essentially says, don't do that. Don't embrace your brokenness. Like, let Christ into your heart so that he can transform you to be what you were meant to be. And so how those echoes of original man are in our hearts, and Christ is saying, listen to those echoes, because that's what I'm promising you. All right. And so those desires were never completely stamped out of us, right? And so Christ wants to fulfill those desires in us. And so the first thing he did, and which we talked about in the first week, he elevates our desires, right? He makes us want to desire the right things for the right reasons in the right way at the right time and all of that. And then he gives us the power to do that, all right? And so we're going to talk about the power that Christ gives us today, okay? Remember last week we ended with what we were sort of talking about, freedom from the law. And we had on the screen, we had Galatians 5:13-18, where St. Paul reminds the Galatians, you were called for freedom, brothers, but do not use this freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. Remember, for St. Paul, flesh is just simply our lower, like sort of our fallen nature, right? Not just our body. Rather, serve one another through love, right? So this invitation to give, right? We were made to give. For the whole law is fulfilled in one statement, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I say then, live by the Spirit, and you will certainly not gratify the desire of the flesh. And so we talked last week about how Christ very specifically, what it means when it says he gives us freedom from the law. And what it essentially means is, right, by changing our desires, by changing them into what they ought to be, the law suddenly doesn't feel like a burden for us. Right? The law no longer feels like a burden. So, right, I think we used the example of maybe killing your roommate or something. Like, do you really need a law saying, thou shalt not kill your roommates? No, because you don't desire to kill your roommates. And so in that respect, the law is not a burden. You're free from it, right? You're free to live without that being a burden, right? And so Christ does that in all of our desires, right? Transforming our desires, because he who is the fulfillment of every single desire we have, right? Every desire you have, ultimately, it's like the Kevin Bacon game, right? It goes right back to Christ. And in fact, in prayer, if you talk to Christ about your desires and you tell him very specifically, and you be vulnerable and say, I desire this. I know it's twisted. He will untwist it. Okay. And so that's what this is really all about, is letting him untwist our desires to put them on the objects that they were meant to be on. All right. And so he does that by sharing his life with us, right? That's why he became man. And so we then experience the law, like the pullings of the law, something good, right? Because now we're desiring not to avoid falling into sin, but to do the good thing that's attached to it, right? So now I don't necessarily need the law not to kill my neighbor, but my desires are wide open to Christ, and now I actually love him and desire his good. All right. But until we get there, right, the law feels like a burden. And it tends to be, like I said, like, the command not to kill your roommate, not really a burden. The command not to look at a woman with lust in your heart, that's a burden, right? And so those places, and we're going to talk about this in the questions, those places where you still feel the law as a burden, those are the places you have to open wide your heart to Christ, okay? Those are the places you have to be very specific and tell him, all right? And so the law is a good thing because it holds us in that tension. It moves us in the right direction, right? Because we may not perfectly desire what is good, true, and beautiful, but the law points us in that direction, right? And so remember, we talked about freedom last week, right? And St. Paul talks about it. Freedom is for something, right? And freedom is for love. Like ultimately, what we want to do is remove every burden that gets in our way of receiving the gift of God and giving away love. And so remember, for John Paul II, the fall makes us grasp things. I use the example of Reese's peanut butter cups. One of my boys grasps Reese's peanut butter cups rather than allowing me to give them to him. So Christ, in sort of echoing to that grace of creation, is now offering us sort of a chance, a redo in the grace of redemption. All right, and that's where we are. All right, so Christ's words bear witness that the original power, therefore also the grace of the mystery of creation, becomes for each of them power of the mystery of redemption. All right, and so in a certain sense, can't go back to Eden, but why did God allow man to leave Eden anyway? Because he had something better to give us, right? Always as a father, right? So we left Eden because he had something better to give us, right? Adam was in a state of grace. He's in this paradise, but the incarnation had not happened, right? And so God brought about the incarnation, this wedding. Remember I said, use the image of Christ on the cross as sort of like this wedding picture of like what it looks like when God and man come together and what the love of God looks like to man. All right. Okay. So that's where we are. All right. So what I want to do now is we're going to talk about, and this will be sort of the most practical of the probably the talks. I want to talk about, ultimately, I want to talk about purity, and then I want to talk about chastity. And we're going to talk about how to get there. All right. And we're going to sort of deviate a little bit out of theology of the body and go back to love and responsibility. But the theme is sort of the same. And what I want to do is I'm going to read. I don't necessarily always like to read things, but this image, because it'll set this image really well in your mind, from C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce. How many of you guys have read that? You probably read it at STMA, right? Yeah, so you may even remember this, right? So this, it's sort of like, think about like Dante's Divine Comedy, like in this sort of pseudo purgatorial state of where the main sort of protagonist is being brought through this place, this sort of this waiting place for heaven, where people have to choose to go to heaven or hell. All right, not necessarily a theological commentary, but it is a great commentary on the human heart. And so I want to read this part. I saw coming toward us a ghost who carried something on his shoulder. All right, so the ghosts are the people who have died, and they're in this sort of holding pattern, trying to decide whether they want to go back down to hell, or they want to be free and go to heaven. Like all the ghosts, he was unsubstantial, but they differed from one another as smokes differ. Some had been whitish. This one was dark and oily. What sat on his shoulder was a little red lizard, and it was twitching its tail like a whip and whispering things in his ear. As we caught sight of him, he turned his head to the reptile with a snarl of impatience. "Shut up, I tell you," he said. It wagged its tail and continued to whisper to him. He ceased snarling and presently began to smile. Then he turned and started to limp westward, away from the mountains. "Off so soon?" said a voice. The speaker was more or less human in shape, but larger than a man, and so bright that I could hardly look at him. So in this book, these sort of saints come from heaven to guide these people to heaven. His presence smote on my eyes and my body too, for like the morning sun at the beginning of a tyrannous summer day. "Yes, I'm off," said the ghost. "Thanks for all your hospitality, but it's no good, you see. I told this little chap," and he's talking to the lizard, "that he'd have to be quiet if he came, which he insisted on doing. Of course, his stuff won't do here. I realize that. But he won't stop. I shall just have to go home. Would you like me to make him be quiet?" said the flaming spirit, an angel, as I now understood. "Of course I would," said the ghost. "Then I'll kill him," said the angel, taking a step forward. Look out. You're burning me. Keep away," said the ghost, retreating. "Don't you want him to be killed?" "You didn't say anything about killing him at first. I hardly meant to bother you with anything so drastic as that." "It's the only way," said the angel, whose burning hands were now very close to the lizard. "Shall I kill it?" "Well, that's a further question. I'm quite open to consider it, but it's a new point, isn't it? I mean, for the moment, I was only thinking about silencing it up because up here, well, it's so damn embarrassing." "May I kill it?" "Well, there's time to discuss that later. There is no time. May I kill it? Please, I never meant to be such a nuisance. Please, really, don't bother. Look, it's gone to sleep on its own accord. I'm sure it'll be right now. Thanks ever so much. May I kill it? Honestly, I don't think there's the slightest necessity for that. I'm sure I shall be able to keep it in order now. I think the gradual process would be far better than killing it. The gradual process is of no use at all. Don't you think so? Well, I'll think it over what you said very carefully. I honestly will. In fact, I'd let you kill it now, but as a matter of fact, I'm not feeling frightfully well today. It would be most silly to do it now. I'd need to be in good health for the operation. Some other day, perhaps. There is no other day. All days are present now. Get back, you're burning me. How can I tell you to kill it? You'd kill me if you did. It's not so. Why, you're hurting me now. I never said it wouldn't hurt you. I said it wouldn't kill you. Oh, I know. You think I'm a coward, but it isn't that. Really, it isn't. I say, let me run back by tonight's bus and get an opinion from my own doctor. I'll come again the first moment I can. This moment contains all moments. Why are you torturing me? You're jeering at me. How can I let you tear me in pieces? If you wanted to help me, why didn't you kill the damn thing without asking me before I knew? It would be all over by now if you had. I cannot kill it against your will. It is impossible. Have I your permission? The angel's hands were almost closed on the lizard, but not quite. Then the lizard began chattering to the ghost so loud that even I could hear what he was saying. Be careful, it said. He can do what he says. He can kill me. One fatal word from you, and he will. Then you'll be without me forever and ever. It's not natural. How could you live? You'd be only a sort of ghost, not a real man as you are now. He doesn't understand. He's only a cold, bloodless, abstract thing. It may be natural for him, but it isn't for us. Yes, yes. I know there's no real pleasures now, only dreams. But aren't they better than nothing? And I'll be so good. I admit I've sometimes gone too far in the past, but I promise I won't do it again. I'll give you nothing but really nice dreams, all sweet and fresh and almost innocent. You might say quite innocent. Have I your permission? Said the angel to the ghost. I know it will kill me. It won't, but supposing it did. You're right. It would be better to be dead than to live with this creature. Then I may. Damn and blast you. Go on, can you? Get it over. Do what you like, bellowed the ghost, but ended whimpering, God help me, God help me. All right, so it goes on, and we'll skip to that in a second. So let's talk about this for a second. What the guy is doing and what the angel's trying to do, right? So the lizard is lust, right? And the guy is afraid to kill the lust because it will somehow make him less than a man, right? Like he's thinking it's going to take, if he takes my lust, sexual desire goes with it, right? That's ultimately what he's saying. And the angel is trying to coax him to kill it, okay? To kill the lust. And let's keep going and we'll figure out why. Next moment, the ghost gave a scream of agony, such as I had never heard on earth. The burning one closed his crimson grip on the reptile, twisted it while it bit and writhed, and then flung it, broken backed, on the turf. Ow, that's done for me, gasped the ghost, reeling backwards. For a moment, I could make out nothing distinctly. Then I saw, between me and the nearest bush, unmistakably solid, but growing every moment solider, the upper arm and the shoulder of a man. Then brighter still and stronger, the legs and the hands. The neck and the golden head materialized while I watched. And if my attention had not wavered, I should have seen the actual completing of a man, an immense man, naked, not much, notice naked, right? Not much smaller than the angel. What distracted me was the fact that at the same moment, something seemed to be happening to the lizard. At first, I thought the operation had failed. So far from dying, the creature was still struggling and even growing bigger as it struggled. As it grew, it changed. Its hinder parts grew rounder. The tail, still flickering, became a tail of hair that flickered between huge and glossy buttocks. Suddenly, I started back, rubbing my eyes. What stood before me was the greatest stallion I've ever seen, silvery white, but with mane and a tail of gold. It was smooth and shining, rippled with swells of flesh and muscle, whinnying and stamping with its hooves. At each stamp, the land shook and the trees dindled. The new made man turned and clapped the new horse's neck, and he jumped on the horse and rode off. All right. Okay, so the second half of this is what he did was purify his desire, and now he's able to ride the desire the way God intended. All right. And that's what Jesus is offering us, right? And so remember when I said, and a couple of you looked strangely at me, that sex for Adam and Eve was far better than we could possibly imagine. And the reason for that is when you have virtue, there's fruit with it. There's a sweetness that comes from virtue, right? And so the cheap pleasure, like running to McDonald's when you're on your way to Angus Barn, the cheap pleasure, we get stuck in that and don't have any idea how great the actual joy and pleasure is of the thing, right? That's what Christ is offering us, right? And it's so much better if we like, so any sort of like worldly explanation about repression, all those, no, it's so we can fly. It's an opening up so that we can give ourselves in the way that God intended, and we can be free to do that, and so we can fly, okay? So that's what Christ is offering us, and that's what Lewis is talking about in this quote, which comes a little bit further down when he sort of explains what we just read. And he says, lust is a weak, poor, whimpering, whispering thing when compared with that richness and energy of desire, which will arise when lust has been killed, right? And so this was, in a lot of ways, this was Augustine's problem, right? Like Augustine was, he's on the sort of spiritual journey, but he couldn't let go of his lust, right? And because he was afraid that if he let it go, it would somehow kill him, right? It would somehow make him, not necessarily physically kill him, but it would somehow make him something less than a man, or something less than he was made to be. And where if we let go of lust and let Christ purify it, we become way more manly, okay? All right, and so going back to what I said, like when you have those desires, you have to show them to Christ, because only he can fix them, right? Like us trying to do it ourselves, not going to happen, right? My prayer changed when I did stuff like that. When I let Christ know like what was on my heart so that he can untwist those things, all right? And so what Christ does when you do that, he then looks at the desires that are on your heart and then puts his desires for you in their place, right? But you have to be honest and open and vulnerable with him, right? It's, we spend so much time in the spiritual life like pretending, right? Like it's okay, right? It's okay to just go, you know what? Because he already knows it, right? He already knows it. But you have to kill it. He has to have your permission, right? Which means he has to have your cooperation. You have to see it, and you have to say, I know that what you're offering me is so much better than what this is. Please don't let me settle for the cheap imitation. All right. So how do we now avoid the cheap imitation? All right. So that's what we're going to talk about. All right. So remember, at a certain point, we picked up this saying from the Sermon on the Mount from Christ: "Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God." All right. And apparently that's just in Matthew, no verse or anything. So I think it's in chapter 5. All right. So what is the reward for purity? What is Christ saying? That if you're pure, what is the reward? You'll see God. Okay. In heaven? Yeah. But what he's really saying is the person who can see purely sees God everywhere. Everywhere, right? We talked about that with St. Paul in Romans. He talks about like the wise man can see God in creation, right? Well, the pure man can see God in his wife or in a woman he meets or his friend, right? It doesn't even have to be. So the person who is chaste is also a better friend too, not just a better lover, all right? Because with purity of heart comes the ability to see the image of God in another person, right? And so this is why you love your neighbor for God's sake, right? For the love of God, because what God actually does is give you the love he has for that person, and you now love them much more completely, okay? So that reward then, that reward to see God is hindered insofar as we let lust wound our ability to love. Like that's what lust does, right? Think of it in a negative term, like what it actually does to us, right? We were made for this incredible ability to love, and all lust does is wounds that, all right? And so when we really grasp that, we get to the point where we don't want it anymore, right? Where that fleeting pleasure isn't worth it, right? Because it's going to ultimately make me unhappy and make me not be able to love. All right, so the typical first question when we start talking about these questions is, how far is too far? All right. Working with young men and campus ministry, I get that question a lot. Like, there are many, many young men who ask that question. And when we ask that question, like the first time I'm asked that question, I always say it's the wrong question, right? Because it's not framed within the realm of Christian freedom, right? That's not a free man doesn't ask that question. How far is too far, right? That's the man who's constrained by something, and he's like, okay, I'm not real clear where the line is in which I have to stop, all right? And so to even ask the question is to admit that the law is a burden, all right? And that there's something in our heart that needs to be transformed. But it also does have a certain value to it, because remember when I said when you're at the stage where the law is a burden, that's just a process of Christ purifying us, okay? And so there is a line to be drawn between simple desire, what John Paul II called the sexual urge, and lust, all right? And we don't always know where that line is, right? And so John Paul II gives us sort of 3 stages in which we can sort of gauge where we're at. And it's important to know these stages because it helps us to combat lust. All right, I'm going to read the whole quote and then we'll just sort of break it down. Sensuality. Remember, sensuality is that attraction to the sexual value of someone else's body. All right, and remember we talked about like what attracts us to someone, right? It's we find some good, which he calls the sexual value, in the other person, right? And it can be either sensuality, their body, or sentimentality, their masculinity and femininity. All right. Sensuality reacts to sexual values connected specifically with the body. Nevertheless, is not identified with lust. Okay, it's not the same. Attraction is not lust. All right, because remember, what tends to happen to us as Christians is we think, okay, I can either indulge or repress. Those are my 2 choices, right? And so we go, well, indulging, that would definitely be wrong. So I'll just repress, right? Which is what the guy is doing with the lizard, right? He's like, oh, he'll be quiet. It's fine. He won't, like, what Christ is saying is, no, don't do either one of those 2 things. Be free, okay? Nevertheless, is not identified with lust. It orients the whole psyche towards the sexual values, awakening an interest in the other person. All right, so this is sort of an awakening. I'm attracted to someone because I sense a certain sexual value attached to them. Okay, that's just natural and spontaneous. The spontaneous process is set up in the subject, which culminates in the desire to possess the value. All right, so now we get to the point of, okay, I see the person. Now, what am I going to do with that, right? Am I going to say the sexual value is all the value to this person? They have no other value, and use them. Or am I going to let it get bound up in the value that is the whole person? Okay. Sensual concupiscence is not yet the desire to possess. And I'll make all this simple in a second. Sensual concupiscence is not yet the desire to possess, but has marked tendency to develop into it. When carnal concupiscence is not kept within its bounds, but communicates itself to the will, on which it tries to impose its own characteristic attitude to the object. Okay. So typical sort of deep philosophical language. So the first thing is that sort of spontaneous reaction. Okay, so all I've done is notice the sexual value of the other person. Okay, and then you have this you're spontaneously drawn towards them. So you have this desire based upon the value of the person. Okay, and then he says step 2 is sensual concupiscence. Now I see and I get some pleasure and I see the person as an object to enjoy. All right. And so now here's the sort of the point at which I have to make an act of the will of some sort, right? I can either look at the person and acknowledge the sexual value and be done, right? Like, or remind myself that the value is an entire person. That's just pointing. That's just the way God draws me towards another person, right? Or I can engage in what he calls carnal desire. Okay, and so that's this sort of active pursuit of pleasurable internal feelings. All right, that's what he's talking about. So what he means is, okay, now I'm just going to use that person as an object. right? And we do this in all kinds of subtle ways, right? It's not just, it's not just like, okay, like I'm gonna go try to get in bed with her. It can also be, I'm just gonna sit here and stare at her, right? Because it brings me pleasure to just see her. She's beautiful, right? That's using her, okay? That's what we want to avoid, because it treats her as an object, but it also damages us, right? It also wounds our ability to love, because we get habituated to seeing people as objects, right? And so where we draw the line between sinful behavior and just desire and attraction is at that point where we have to make an act of the will, right? To continue to see the person only for their sexual value, or to see them as a person, okay? And so I'm sitting there gawking at her. I can remind myself that that is a person, right? And that ought to, in a certain respect, make me not do that anymore, okay? But we have to habitually do that, right? We have to habitually remind ourselves, like what you're looking at is not just some object, some beautiful sunset, right? It's a person who has way more value than just her attractiveness, all right? And so the line is there, all right? That's the adultery in the heart that Christ was talking about. All right, so understanding that, then we can begin to talk about how freedom operates, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about virtue, then we'll talk about chastity itself as a virtue, and then we'll talk about how to sort of grow in chastity, okay? All right, so St. Thomas says, virtue denotes a certain perfection of a power. Now, a thing's perfection is considered chiefly in regard to its end, but the end of power is act. Wherefore, power is said to be perfect according as it is determined to its act. All right, so I deliberately give you like things from the Summa so that you learn how to read it, right? Like that takes a little bit of that. You're like, what did he just say? And that's fine, because we need to learn how to read it. All right, so virtue, he says, denotes a certain perfection of a power. All right, so we have all of these powers that are directed towards certain ends, right? So I have the power to eat, right? That's directed towards food, which is directed to the end of nourishment of my body, okay? And the virtue of temperance causes me, within me, to always choose based on not so much the pleasure of eating, but on the perfection of the power of nutrition, okay? That doesn't mean pleasure is out of it or anything like that, but that's the idea, right? And so what virtue does is it perfects each of the powers we have. All right, so let's be more specific. So which virtue perfects our power to control our sexual desire? Chastity, right? That's what we're talking about, right? And so what virtue does is takes the disorder of the fall and orders it back to where it's supposed to go. All right, just think of it that way. Really easy to do, right? So as I grow in virtue, I sort of go into the chaos of where my emotions, my feelings, my passions all over the place, and slowly but surely I get them under the control of reason, and the virtue gets stronger and stronger until I have control over those things, all right? And not just control, but perfect control, right? So much so that I can almost command them to happen, right? So the perfectly, to give an example, the perfectly chaste man is able to control his sexual urge so that when he sees a woman, he immediately sees her value as a person and no longer sees her sexual value. So the perfectly chaste husband would only have the sexual urge towards his wife, right? Because he now has complete control over his sexual desire. That's what virtue does. So it takes disorder and orders it, all right? And so when we grow in chastity, we gain control over our sexual desire and put it towards natural end, all right? And we can will it. It becomes so strong we can will it, all right? And so, but this happens through repeated action, right? And at first, it hurts, right? It's really hard. But eventually, it gets a little bit easier, but then we have to do it. So the definition of virtue is a strong and habitual disposition to do the good, okay, to the end of what it's ordered. So the habitual part, we sort of grasp, right? Like I got to repeatedly do it. But it's a firm So it has to keep getting stronger and stronger and stronger. So it's like a spiritual muscle. Okay. So how do you repeatedly strengthen the virtue of chastity? You have to be tempted, right? That's why God allows temptation, right? You have to be tempted, right? But God never tempts us beyond the strength of grace, right? So he's always offering us the grace to overcome the temptation. And that's precisely so that we grow in virtue, right? And so over time, chastity gets easier and easier, and with the ease comes pleasure, right? Because now we're using our faculties for what they intended to do. So the man who's temperate, the man who has a virtue of fasting, actually enjoys food more than the man who is a glutton. All right. The man who is chaste, the husband who is chaste, actually enjoys the marital bliss with his wife more than the man who's filled with lust. All right. We have to ultimately think about and be convinced of that truth. That because it fulfills a desire in the right way, and God has attached a sweetness to it, right? So mature trees, right, have fruit on them, and fruit is sweet. And so the idea of mature virtue is there's always a sweetness to it, right? That's why Our Lady can still be joyful even in the midst of suffering, right? All right. So let's now sort of scope down to chastity. So St. Thomas says, chastity takes its name from the fact that reason chastises concupiscence, which, like a child, needs curbing. Okay, so this idea of chastising in the sense of almost like holding it down. Okay, the word chastity actually means to clean. Okay, to clean, right? And so, which I think is really kind of cool for us to reflect on, because what it ultimately does is removes the things that are dirty in sex, right? That's ultimately what it does. Right? Sex itself is not dirty, but it removes the things that are dirty in sex. All right, so we have these things called appetites, things that draw us towards the good or away from evil things. All right, and so we have two of these, and the first one is what's called the concupiscable appetite. And this is the appetite towards which we go to things that we need to survive. Like we have a natural desire for food, right? That's part of the concupiscable appetite. And you'll see why I'm going this deep in a second. We have a natural desire for sex. That's part of the concupiscable appetite, all right? But think about the man who really likes chocolate, right? Really, really likes chocolate. And then he gets diabetes and he can't have chocolate anymore, right? Eventually, at first, really hard. Eventually, what happens is he no longer wants the chocolate, right? Chocolate is not a temptation for him anymore because he's grown in the virtue of temperance, right? That's just a simple example of what that looks like, right? He only desires the things that a diabetic should eat. Now, the person who doesn't have virtue will struggle, right? And their health will suffer because of that. And so what happens is we habitually shape our desires towards the right things, okay? That's virtue, habitually shaping and pushing our desires towards the right thing, right? And so the person, like the guy who likes chocolate, he may end up actually liking broccoli, right? Because it's good for him and he gets pleasure in eating it, okay? All right, so what I gave there, right, makes chastity sound like something negative, right? And this is part of the problem with chastity. And John Paul II in Love and Responsibility calls it, there's this inherent resentment of chastity, all right? And part of it is we struggle to come up with a positive definition for it, all right? We can have negative ideas about like, oh, it's holding back our sexual desire so that we don't sin. We don't do these things. And so in our age, where any sort of limitation on freedom is seen as a bad thing, chastity is made fun of, right? Let's be honest. Like, how many guys have you gone up to and just talk about chastity with them, right? They're gonna be like, dude, get away, right? And so what, John, go ahead, Eric.
Actually, when I was in Florida, we had, when I was in an Uber ride with my brother to the airport, the driver was talking about this festival they have there in Key West. And like, he was talking about a lot of very sort of more inappropriate things, and just talked about it with such casualness, and was like, oh, well, we're all guys here, we know how it is. And it's like, that's such an insidious problem that it's just because you're a guy, like chastity's a joke.
Yep.
But
yes.
The modern culture.
And that's exactly what he's talking about. So he says, okay, if we continue to just treat chastity as this long no, just one long no, then it's going to continue to be seen in that light, right? What he says is, okay, what we really need is to take from the resentment of chastity and rehabilitate it so that we can look at it in a positive way, right? And the danger, right, is this can sometimes creep into our own mindset, right? Because we think about, okay, if love is just this emotional and like physical experience, then putting a governor on it seems like a bad thing, right? Like it seems like if it's just a subjective, like if it's all about really using the other person to make myself feel like I'm in love, like that's what ultimately, like that's what the world, if you sort of analyze what really goes on, what people think about falling in love, I fell out of love with you, so we have to get divorced. All of that is really about using the other person so that I feel good by the fact that we're in this sort of situation where we're simulating love, where there's this mutual use, okay? And so any sort of governor on that is immediately seen as something bad, right?
So you talked about like this idea of like falling in love with someone, and that reminds me of someone that I knew at state who I guess last spring had been dating this guy for I guess a year or two maybe. And like they were talking about getting married and stuff, and then come back to campus in the spring. She's like, everyone's like, oh, what's going on? But you two were together, and she's like, yeah, I just realized I wasn't in love with him anymore at some point. And broke up.
Yeah, I mean, and that's all over the place, right? Like that is, I mean, unfortunately, it doesn't end when you're like 22. I have friends who get divorced because of that, right? And so what we need to begin to see is this what chastity ultimately is, right? Is it acts as a shield from keeping like our fallen natures from entering into the relationship, right? From keeping concupiscence from entering into the relationship. All right, so let's talk about the negative side of it. So we're first going to talk about what chastity frees us from, and then we'll flip it and then talk about what chastity frees us for. All right, so John Paul II says, the structures of sin. He says, the sexual values connected with the body of the person become not only an object of interest, but quite easily the object of sexual desire. The object of sexual desire is supposed to be what? The person, right? The person. Here we stand on the threshold of sin, and we see that concupiscence, which seeks continually to induce the will to cross it, is rightly called the germ of sin. All right, so we're going to always be pulled, and we said this is the strongest pull of all the pulls, right? Because it's a power that once it becomes the stallion, right, it enables us to love like God loves. That's why it's so powerful. As soon as the will consents, this is not something merely happening to a man. So he's saying, up to the point of like, I'm drawn, attracted, it's just sort of just happening to me, right? And then once I give my consent, I'm doing the thing rather than, but something he himself is actively doing. At first, only internally, for the will is in the first place the source of interior acts. All right, so this point is really important because it pertains to virtue. There's this tendency to think, well, it's only wrong if I act on it, if I do something exterior, right? No, that just means that your will was stronger, that it sort of spilled out over from the inside, right? So if I have the will to kill someone, but I don't ever actually do it, still wrong, right? My will is still twisted, right? That just means that maybe I was too much of a coward. Maybe I just, like my will wasn't strong enough to do it, whatever it is. But the point is that those interior movements of the will is what actually makes us into what we are, right? So in a certain respect, we become what we do, okay, in that way, right? And I think I've used this example plenty of times, right? Like a person who lies continually becomes a liar, right? Somebody who steals continually becomes a thief. And so that, the opposite of virtue, right, is vice. And that's what vices do to us. They sort of attack our identity in a certain way, right? And this is why, by the way, people will almost always identify themselves with their sin, because it comes and ends up almost overtaking the person, right? And so that if you were to attack the sin, they take it as a personal attack upon them, right? And we got plenty of examples. I don't want to get off on that tangent, but the point is that we, in a certain respect, our sin sort of takes away our identity, right? All right. So that is the sort of so chastity shields us from that, right? Chastity is the thing that would stop us at the point where we go, okay, like this has moved beyond just like noticing, and now I'm willing to gawk, or now I'm willing to do whatever. Okay. Chastity is the shield there. So it frees us from that, right? Where we habitually won't do that. All right. But more importantly, and this is where we now begin to think about the positive side, right? I'll skip this because it's more or less what we just talked about. So how we become slaves to sin. So John Paul II says, the suggestion that what is pleasant is good, it comes to govern the whole activity of the will, completely perverts it. All right. So we habitually, right, if we continue to do that, then we don't have the sort of internal fortitude to do anything unpleasant. All right. To do anything that's unpleasant. And that becomes a huge obstacle for virtue, because virtue early on is really unpleasant, right? Because we're taking all of those things in us that are aimed towards pleasure, and saying, no, right? But the no ultimately is so that we can say yes to the right thing, okay? And this is the positive part of chastity. This is what we really need to focus on, all right? That the fact that by saying no to lust, we're saying yes to love. All right. And so chastity opens us up to freely love. So chastity can only be thought of in association with the virtue of love. Its function is to free love from the utilitarian attitude. So first, we have to accept the Christian understanding of what love is, right? Love is, to use John Paul II's language, love is to make a gift of myself to another person, right? It's just there, and in doing that, it's just a response to God's love, who gives everything to us. And so that idea of self-mastery, right, like owning yourself so that you can give yourself away, isn't the whole meaning of chastity. It's just meant to be this mechanism by which we're liberated to love in the way that God loves, all right? And it also guards us from being swayed by our emotion. This mistaken view of chastity explains the common inference that it is purely a negative virtue. Chastity in this view is one long no, which we talked about, while it is above all the yes of which certain no's are the consequence, right? So it's first and foremost a yes to love. But when you say yes to one thing, there's all kind of no's that follow it, right? Right, like when I got married, the world became binary, right? All the women, it was my wife and not my wife, right? And so I can just look at every woman and go, not my wife, right? Really simple, right? But it's because I said yes to her that I say no to the other, right? Like profoundly. Only the chaste man and the chaste woman are capable of true love. Think about it for just a second. Like that is a profound statement, right? So when you're looking for women and you're looking for a companion, that should be rule number one, right? Like only the chaste man and the chaste woman are capable of true love. Think about Our Lady and Saint Joseph. Like their love of their marriage was perfect, right? Because they were both chaste, right? And in fact, so perfect was their love and so chaste was their love, right? That love was still fruitful even though they never had sex, right? That's how fruitful that chaste love can be. For chastity frees their association, including their marital intercourse, from that tendency to use a person. So it's a no, but it's a yes to that full blossoming of spousal love and friendship. That's what Christ offers us, right? But we've got to be willing to suffer to get there, right? Like this is, especially in our culture, this is a call to like heroism. Like honestly, like to be chaste in today's world is a heroic decision, right? And that's why it's really important that like he says, the chaste man and the chaste woman are capable of true love. Like you look for a chaste woman, but the woman becomes more chaste when you commit to guarding her chastity, right? When you use your chastity as a guard over hers, because that's what the men have to initiate it, right? Because women, especially young women today, have been told all kinds of lies about how they have to hold on to men, right? In a lot of ways, we talked about this already. A lot of the ways we have to show them like what their true value is. Like they're looking at themselves and seeing only sexual value, and you have to show them so much more, right? And so you're first and foremost, and this is why it's so important when you gaze at a woman and you're attracted to her, to immediately remind yourself of the value of the person. Because by invoking your chastity, you protect hers from the very moment you meet her. All right. All right. So last thing. All right. And this is on the more practical side. I deliberately said earlier about the concupiscable appetite. I threw out the big word. It wasn't just to wow you guys with something I knew. It's because eating and our sexual desire, or wasn't only for that. Eating and sexual desire are linked together. Okay. And so the way to grow in chastity is to fast. Because if I learn how to control the lower desire of the concupiscable appetite, I will learn to control the higher. All right. And so that's why St. Thomas talks about fasting being the guardian of chastity. All right. And so, especially as young men, when our desire is at the strongest, we have to have the virtue of fasting too. Right. So fasting is a virtue. All right. It's not just something we do, because fasting perfects our nature, right? And anything that perfects our nature is a virtue, right? And so fasting both perfects our nature when it comes to food, but also to sex. And so when you guys are in the discussion, there's a question about fasting there. But we have to get in the habit of fasting. Like it should be, it used to be, this is not me like pining for the old days, but the church had this certain percentage of fasting days and feasting days. And the fasting days were just enough in the liturgical calendar that you could pretty easily develop the virtue of fasting. The church knew what they were doing, right? And there's been a movement away from that in the church, but that's not a reason to stop, right? That is not the call is still there. Like St. Thomas says, fasting is part of the natural law. So it's something we have to do in order to be perfected. All right. And remember, I know we've talked about this before, fasting is hard. You don't necessarily have to make it harder by doing these like unbelievable fasts. But all of our fasts, Christ already merited the graces for them in the desert. That's why he fasted. He fasted for like in the desert. He was sitting there and he knew that on Fridays, Rob's going to fast. So I'm gonna win grace for him right here. And so each Friday I go to him and I'm like, I need the grace that you won for me in the desert during those 40 days, right? So we never fast alone, right? And so that part is really, really important for us to understand, right? That fasting is hard. And you will, when you begin to fast regularly, if you don't already, you will find that there is a certain amount of spiritual warfare that goes with it. That there will always be temptations to go, not today. Like I've got to do this. I didn't feel well yesterday. I get headaches. I like all of the litany of things, right? And just know, like Christ in the desert, like fasting is one of the things that the devil hates. Okay, because of what it turns us into and who we do it with. All right, questions. I threw a lot of stuff at you there, but yes.
Do you happen to know how many days of fasting there was?
Yeah, it was something. Well, so the 40 days of Lent were actual fast days, right? And every Friday was a fast day. I want to say it was something like 40% of the like liturgical calendar were fast days. So they'd fast every day before, like on the vigil of any feast day. But they had so many more feast days too, because they could enjoy them, right? Like the fasting man enjoys feasting because he knows the right use of food and he knows how to moderate himself even when he's feasting, right? So he doesn't sit down and feast and go, well, I'll just have an apple, right? He actually eats and enjoys it, right? And because God attached pleasure to food, for like it's something you can praise him for, right? Like I eat a good, like a good steak or something, like praise be God, right? But if I'm a glutton, I can never enjoy that because I'm just thinking about, well, how fast can I eat this so that I have room for the fries or the pie or the whatever.
So,
Okay.
actually, that makes me think here. It says that similarities between the virtues between chastity and temperance is a similar matter with desensitization, where if you are doing this all the time, it no longer provides any pleasure because you're so desensitized to it.
Yeah.
So, in terms of fasting and like specific practices, are you talking about like how it's, I guess, Good Friday and Ash Wednesday, where it's like one full meal and two snacks together?
Yeah. So essentially, like fasting, at least, like there's all kind of different ways. You do it in freedom, right? So you do it in a way you can tolerate. But St. Thomas, when he talks about fasting, he just says, in essence, skip a meal. Like if you add that up, right? So in other words, it's like 2 small meals, 1 normal sized meal. You've skipped a meal, right? And so that, like, however that works for you, and however that you can do that in freedom. Because I mean, some people, like somebody's on medication, they're like they have to eat like certain times a day. So, but even doing simple things like taking a little less when you sit down to eat, like not salting your food. There's all these different ways in which you can, like, because ultimately, right, that's not fasting in the sense of like foregoing food, but it's lessening the control that food has over us. And some of that is you have to be humble enough to go and honest enough to go, yeah, I can't do it like this yet, or I can't do it like this at all, right? And then just adjust from however you need to do that.
And in terms of frequency, you're saying every Friday?
Yeah. So Friday is still, even though it's not really something talked about a whole, it's still a day of penance in the church. Like you should be doing very specific penances so that you put yourself at the foot of the cross to receive the grace Christ wants to give you on that day, right?
Yeah. I feel like I've read or heard somewhere that according to canon law, technically we're still supposed to abstain from meat on Fridays or engage in a different.
Yeah. So yeah, according to canon law, you have to do some active penance on Friday. So certainly abstaining. Why is that not talked about?
People don't like rules.
Yeah, I mean, some of that is like, yeah, I think it's like there's plenty of reasons why. I mean, anything that like anything in which you tell people no, like seems to be an imposition, right? They're like, oh, well, you can't, you just let them come in freedom, right? But if you don't ever, like, the law is there for a reason so that we know where freedom is, right? I would never know that without the law. Like I would never know that, fasting on Friday or doing penance on Friday was a thing without the law telling me that. And so I can freely do that. Like, and I so now I get to a certain point where I actually desire to do penance on Friday. I don't need that anymore, right? And I could do in freedom. I could go, oh yeah, like it's the night before my friend's wedding. I'm just gonna do some other penance and have meat at the reception or like whatever, right? Yeah, it can be anything like that, right? It can be, but the point is there's a spirit to it. But if we get too carried away with the spirit, we also drop the letter too, right? And that's, I think, if I were to sort of articulate what the problem is now, is the fact that we got so caught up in the spirit of the law, we forgot what the law actually was. And so I think that's, okay. All right, so they ditched you guys, which is fine. It's a little difficult to do the questions. Any other questions?